In this week's video, I'm going to be talking about perspective, my perspective, and also how some emotions that I've had over the last couple of weeks have really shaped this painting. My name is jbabs, and I paint every week. When I started this painting, I didn't really set out to paint anything in particular. I just started putting color to page and I was gonna see what happens. And sometimes that's how painting works. Or when you're creating an artwork or a concept, you don't necessarily know what you're gonna start out with, but just putting something down helps to get things moving. It had been a pretty rough week with a lot of things being shown on social media, mainstream media, a lot of opinions going around, and it was all making for emotion that was building up. And I decided to paint and wanted to release some of that emotion. A lot of that started out as anger, which turned to frustration because I felt helpless that I couldn't be there. I couldn't be there on the front lines. I mean, I found things to do to help voice my support and also to help give my support in other tangible ways. However, it's no substitute, and I still had a lot of energy. I had been up for like a few nights. It's maybe a week since I painted this. I'm only just editing it now, but essentially just being up trying to keep up with the news, with what's happening, with what is supposed to happen next. And that's been the biggest topic right now. After all those emotions are gone, it quickly just turns into sadness because that feeling of helplessness starts to creep back in. Helplessness in the sense of something happened and, you know, tomorrow's gonna come, maybe next week's gonna come, and you know, we're gonna not remember this happened. It's gonna be another story. But surprisingly, it hasn't been like that this time. It's stuck around for a little bit longer. And unfortunately, it's because of how things have escalated. I watched it go from, you know, seeing a lot of people calling out, for justice, not getting the justice, and then taken to the streets. And then unfortunately that started to escalate, really quickly. And then you started seeing the fires. Then you started seeing the broken storefronts. And that, nobody ever wants to go through that. Nobody ever wants to see that. While I understand the pain, it was really sad to see. But all in all, I understood it. I understood where the frustration was coming from. I don't live in America, but I live close. And through my experiences that started to come back to me, I could not put myself in the shoes of people living in America right now. because it hurts just thinking about it. I had an incident or an occasion when I had my own run-ins with law enforcement. It happened on a couple of occasions. I've had the traffic stop. I've had the, you know, check while you're walking. I believe they used to call it stop and frisk. But this story is the most insane one. This is the one where I was I was picking up my zip car. A zip car is for those of you who don't know, a zip car is a ride sharing program, and it's I like to describe it as Netflix, but for cars. Netflix for cars. And I was picking up mine. It was winter time. It gets really cold up here, and you don't need a key to enter a zip car. So when you go to pick up your zip car, you're using a card, and you're scanning that card. And the location of that scan is at the top of the front windshield. When I was picking it up, I was scanning it as usual. It took a few tries because it was freezing and the car battery was not warm. It must have just been frozen. And someone watched as I tried to enter the car after a few tries, and they thought that I was stealing the car. So they must have called the cops. After I got in the car, I went to a convenience store, an outlet. Up here we have Robba, that's the name of the outlet. And when I came out of the outlet, I got into my zip car because I was a little bit hungry. And right before I pulled out, 2 cop cars pulled up right behind me. And I was like, what is happening? Are they here for me? Are they here for someone else? Did something happen? And then I noticed one of them come round to the side of my driver's seat, and he had his hand on his holster, and he was waving for me to get out of the car. And I was like, okay, mistaken identity for sure. I got out of the car immediately, no questions asked. I was spun around and backed up into my zip car, and I'm not talking lightly. It was aggressive. And I asked him, I was like, hey, is this protocol? And he responded by saying, yes, in the case of a stolen vehicle, this is what happens. And unfortunately, I didn't want to question it, because one thing that me being who I am and understanding how things have gone in the past for other people, I knew best not to question. And it's sad because I knew I wasn't involved in any car theft, but I couldn't question. Anyways, they backed me up into the zip car and put me in the back of one of their cruisers. right before they put me in the back, I started to get a little anxiety because at this point I'm eventually able to unlock my car and I get in the car, and the whole time I was trying to get in as I'm tapping on the scanner and it's not opening. I did notice there was a car parked right across the street from me, and there was this couple in there and they kept looking at me, and them looking at me made it feel much longer than it was. Anyways, I eventually get in a car. I drive to this convenience store to get some food and some drinks so I can have energy for my game, a soccer game. And as I come out of the store, get into my car, I start to pull out of the driveway, and then two cop cars pull up right behind me. And they had their sirens on. I looked in the windshield. I wasn't sure if it was for me, but I know I saw them get out of their cruisers, and one of them started to walk over to my side, the driving side of the car, and I remember I started to get thoughts like, is this for me? Was it that couple looking at me earlier? Did they think I was suspicious? Anyways, he came around to the side of my car and he had his hand hovering above his holster. And that was the first thing I saw. One, because I'm seated and he's obviously standing, so the the height of my vision is towards his waistline, and that's the first thing I saw when he came up to the side of my car. His hand on his holster, not in his holster, but hovering above his holster, and he was gesturing for me to exit the car. And at this point, you know, I'm starting to get a little bit worried because every scenario that I've seen or had seen in the news started to play in my mind because his hand was hovering above his holster. So I get out of the car and immediately as I step out of the car, I was spun around, hands behind my back, and I started to get um searched, and I was like, what's happening here? Is this necessary? And I asked him, I said, is this protocol? And he said, yeah, we believe or we got a report that someone had stolen a vehicle, and this is what happens. And him saying this is what happens, not just because I was getting searched, but also in the manner in which I was getting searched. I was not given a chance to say anything. I was immediately spun around and pinned aggressively to the side of the car, and responded by saying, yes, in the case of a reported stolen vehicle, this would be the approach. And I mean, I obviously had thoughts of my own that I wanted to voice at the time, but again, because all these things play through your mind that you see in the media, you I decided not to question at that point, and I went along with what they needed to do. So they they searched me, and they asked me for my ID, and I told them where it was, and they took the ID, and they started to walk me to the cruiser. And as I'm walking over to the cruiser, keep in mind I had never been in handcuffs before up until this point. Let me actually just pause for a second as I tell this story to talk about what's happening in this painting at the moment, so I can give you an idea of some process. Because I do like to share that in these series. So right now I've done a sketch of a potential composition of the character, or positioning, or gesturing of the character, and I sketched on top of it with very vivid colors to so that I can, and I'll usually squint also so that I can see if this is the type of position I want to end up in at the end of the painting. And this is sped up, so I did keep that for some time, and I thought about it, and I decided to eventually come back to this composition here because it better reflected my mind state at the time. I was I wasn't feeling I like too energetic. I didn't feel like I wanted it to be. By this point I was a lot more calmer, as I had been letting off a lot of energy into this painting. A lot of the anger can be seen with how I'm depicting the environment, a chaotic environment, things on fire, um, harsh lighting on the skin, and I had let all this energy out into the pain, and at this point it's just more feelings of, sadness, and reminiscing on my experiences, and then trying to think of what it must be like for people in America right now. Okay, so back to the story. They took my ID and started to walk me to the cruiser. And as I saw that I was going into the back of the cruiser, I got an unfamiliar, overwhelming sense of anxiety. One, because I had cuffs and my hands were behind my back. It was a first time thing, and they were incredibly tight. And at this point, it started to go from anxiety into a mild panic attack, and where I'm in visible like I'm in clear discomfort at this point, as I see that I'm going into the back of the cruiser, and I I literally start pleading with these people to handcuff me in the front because I had never been in cuffs before, and I told them I felt like I was getting a panic attack. They luckily they alleviated some of my stress and agreed to handcuff me in the front, so I can at least have some mobility while I sit in the back of the cruiser. And the whole time I'm telling them, hey, um, call my zip car. This is a zip car. I understand why someone may have called. I Because I didn't use keys, I used a card, and when I was scanning it, it took a little bit before I could get in. And I told him to just call my zip car. We can clear this up. Meanwhile, I'm in the back of the cruiser, and one of them is running my license. And as a zip car is on the line, after they eventually agree to so as one cop is running my license, the other one is using my phone to call Zipcar. And Zipcar's picks up. I briefly explain the situation on loudspeaker. He puts the phone above the car, and this is relevant. He put the phone above the car while I was sitting in the back of the cruiser, and Zipcar representatives told us we're gonna go on hold for a little bit. And as they're on hold, something happened and the line dropped. And the officer who initially came around to the side of my car, who is also now running my license, didn't find anything because my record was clean. My driving record was clean. And he said, yeah, it's clean. And he came out of the car, walked over to the side and they uncuffed me. We had a brief conversation after that. They didn't really apologize. They apologized that someone had called it in and said that's just the kind of people we have to deal with today. Completely absorbing themselves of any mistreatment during that whole interaction. I sent a complaint to Zipcar. I was told someone would get back to me, which they didn't. I followed up by email, and they still never got back to me. I decided not to file a complaint to the local station because I didn't want to be put on a list, and I genuinely felt like I may have been watched or stopped more often than not because of this list that may or may not exist. Maybe it's my paranoia, but this type of fear is real, and it's because of these types of interactions. And yeah, it's hard to imagine this being that much more worse in other places in the States, and seeing things like we have been in the last couple of weeks. It hits somewhere that you don't want it to hit. No one wants to really be having these feelings, and it would be much better if we didn't have to go through such extremes in order to get people to acknowledge that these things happen. I will say though that after seeing a lot of the support and people voicing, people being vocal with their support, it has filled me with some hope of where we go from here. And while I have my reservations about what will happen on the legislative level, I am hopeful for everyday micro interactions between people. Who you might meet while you're waiting in line for something, who you interact with at the grocery store, people that you work with, people in your building, your neighbors, people on your street. In all these little macro interactions, as people begin to have some kind of dialogue and maintain that dialogue, I think the bias will slowly start to weed its way out. And it's gonna start with individuals, and it will trickle out to their circles. If you're an individual and you're for change and you're open-minded, being vocal about your stance on things is what's going to spark the curiosity of other people that may not be as open-minded as you are. Or maybe they're curious but they never thought they had a safe environment to explore that curiosity and start to learn about other people around them with different backgrounds. And over time, it will trickle out, and we will start to see our communities get better. You'll start to see your community at your workplace get better, whether it's just your team or your department. And if enough people are doing this, I'm really optimistic to see change on that level. And it's the level that we have the most control over. A lot of us think we can't help, but not everyone needs to be in front of Congress to affect change. It really does just start with the person next to you, the few in your friend group, in your network. And if you're in positions to broaden perspectives, for example, if you're a leader in your workplace, being inclusive is a really easy way to make a difference. Being inclusive in all the way down from, jokes that might be passed around to allowing people to give feedback and giving them a chance to give feedback, acknowledging their feedback in front of the group. And that's how people will feel empowered and know that you care about their opinion and that you value what they bring to your team. This doesn't only have to end in professional settings. if you're on a team, on like any kind of team, could be a it could be a for me, I play soccer. Soccer is one of the most inclusive sports, but so often we see isolated acts of racism, and sometimes it's on an insane scale. And being vocal within your team about your support for anti-racism or anti-discrimination is what's going to affect that team and give a positive example. And others that want to follow will see your leadership and they will follow. All they need is just that one spark. Sometimes that's all that's needed. But I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful for these things. I think they will come. And we can all do our part on that level. I'm coming close to the end of the painting here, so I'm doing a lot of touch up. I'm bringing up accents here and there. I'm trying to highlight areas of this rose because I don't want it to get lost. I do want to highlight, the chaos in the background, but I don't want to lose the significance of these roses in the front, because it's an important part of the whole painting. Without it, the painting is just angry. I mean, my facial expression isn't exactly angry either. It's more one of confusion, calm in the chaos, just looking forward to go next. But the roses really add to the story of how I'm feeling in this moment, and that without the roses it wouldn't be as easily conveyed. I'm adding a little bit more noise to the background here just to expand the world, expand the scale a little. Sometimes I'll create shapes, silhouettes, and I'll use the selection tool. I'll use a selection tool to expand or shrink or rotate. Just make sure it's in the scene, it's sitting in the scene correctly, and it's correct. So here I could see that the street was starting to tilt off the page to the left a bit. I do make an adjustment for this a little bit later, because it's not adding the depth that I want it to. I want this second card to really sit behind the main burning car to give it that sense of scale, but because they're almost on the same level on the ground plane, and the ground plane is also full enough to the left, it's making it feel like they're not that far apart. So I make an adjustment here in a little bit just to push it back a bit. When painting things like these, it especially when you have a lot of energy that you're trying to release, these technical things that you go through in your mind as you're trying to correct the painting or correct the perspective, correct the depth, you slowly start to release that energy. And it does help with feeling calmer off the roll of it. I'm adding more highlights to the skin here because I don't want that to get lost. Defining the fingers a bit. This is one of those paintings that I don't. My aim is not to finish. It's just to give an approximation of a feeling. There's a lot of implying going on. Implying of detail. Actually, this is all implied detail. There isn't anything here that's really rendered out. It's all implied. The goal is to look at this painting as a whole and wander around, but not really make any definitive conclusions. At least not on a micro level. I was being goofy again there with making the character wear swords. um, because you always want to know how far away your character is from being a Ninja Turtle. It's a little fun thing I do for the stream. So yeah, just doing some more touch-ups here. I corrected the depth in the background. You'll see that I pushed the horizon line a little bit higher so I can get that second burning vehicle behind uh, this first one. I pushed back the colors in there so the contrast isn't as high, keeping a contrast on this main burning car. But it helps to expand the environment. Thanks for joining me in that session, guys. If you enjoyed that, like the story, I'm not always that person, but sometimes it is good to explain what came behind the painting. But as always, I paint every week. If you want to join me in that journey, drop me a like, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.